3 ways to compensate your team members. Hey and welcome everyone. It's day 31 of our 90-day game plan. And today I thought I'd give you 3 ways how you can compensate team members. I give you the pros, the cons, and maybe a few thoughts on that. The 3 ways, very straightforward. Obviously, regular salary. You can do company participation via stocks or ESOPs. And you have commissions or sales compensation. Anything that's a bit of tied to some performance numbers. Obviously, it depends on a bit of the kind of field you're in or the sector, and it's called a bit different. But these are kind of the 3 different ones. Obviously, you can sub-segment them. I leave it a bit broad, and we kind of dive a bit in. So let's start with the most common one. It's salary. Salary, especially at the beginning as a startup, is the toughest one, especially if you have to compete with the really large companies. Because sometimes these large companies are paying, let's say, $250,000 a year to some of the top engineers. And if you have to pay $250,000 for some of the engineers, you're going to run out of money really, really quickly. So you kind of have to figure out how can you pay people a good salary that they join your company. But at the same time, you have to kind of balance that with how much cash you have. And, the more senior the company gets, the more experience it gets, once you get cash flow positive, the easier it is to pay more salary. So at the end, that's kind of a bit of the trade-off. For the employee, many employees really want the salary. Salary is the version of income that for them is actually the least tax efficient. All the others are way more tax efficient. But it's liquid, it's straightforward, it's easy to calculate. And so I always think salary has to be part of the base compensation. But obviously, the longer you kind of be in a company, you kind of realize the others can be very interesting to be added on top. So what we have done prior until I bought all the stock options back, but I'll talk about this in just a bit, was for any employee, we allowed them to have a mix of salary and a mix of stock options. At this very moment, this is not possible, but we are hoping to bring this back again, and then people can have salary and stock options again. But I think this is a really important concept for you to understand. So you can go and you can take away part of that salary and you can change that into stock options, which is helpful for you as a company, because for you as a company, this means there's no cash out. And for the employee, this means that it can be potentially very interesting if the company does well. Now, obviously, the question is, and this was the case for us, what happens if the company doesn't do well? Then in theory, the employees really lose out. In this case, we went and I took the company's treasury, swapped that for the treasury, swapped that for all the ESOPs, which was quite painful from a money perspective. But I rather had that the employees didn't lose any money, and I rather had that the company paid for that because I thought it wasn't really the employees' fault that their ESOPs didn't really become worth much. But I think that's a really important concept on the salary side. How do you kind of define the salary? At the end, you need to do some benchmarking. So you can do this either via consulting firms or just get some benchmarks from the outside. At the end, you need to do external benchmarking, you need to do some internal benchmarking. And then the question really is how much of that is going to be a salary and how much is going to be other forms of compensation. Here, you can do a couple of things. You can just do a fixed metric. For example, you say 80% is salary, 20% is ESOPs, for example, 90% and 10%. Or you can go and you can say, okay, what's going to be the base salary this person needs? Maybe that person says, look, I know, I need $60,000 a year in salary, and anything above that can be ESOPs. So there's different ways how you can kind of work this out. Just, again, I think for the employee, it's also quite interesting to think this a bit through about having salary and ESOPs, because at the end, I mean, the salary is really important, but tax-wise, it's really inefficient. And upside-wise, right? If you look at all the wealth that's built in this world, it doesn't get built via salary. It gets built via participation in the company. So that's my thought on number 1. Number 2, any participation in the company via shares or options, ESOP plan, and so on, it's named differently, but at the end, it all comes down to the same thing. I think it's an absolute crucial aspect in a business. And here is actually something that I've been teaching over and over again to people that come to me who say they want to start a company for the first time. And my suggestion to them is always, instead of starting a company for the first time, why don't you try to be an early employee in one of those companies and try to get as much stock participation as possible? Because you're going to have way lower downside and you have potentially the same or even more upside with less headache. So I really think, especially if you're joining a startup, you're joining any company, you are going to want to look into their stock participation. And to me, this is also something in a mindset kind of thing. If you are joining a company and you're not willing to take their stock as an employee, you should really kind of consider, why do you want to join this company? Now, fair enough. Look, some people are just happy to find a job. Don't get me wrong here, right? I don't want to criticize that. But if you have options, and many times people do, then you really want to think about who is a company that you're joining, and you can test yourself a bit by checking, would I take this company's stock? Yes or no? And if you do, this is a really, really good indication that you actually believe in what this company does. So you're not just doing this for the salary, you're doing this actually because you believe in what this organization does. And I think that's really important. I think it's also important from the CEO side, right? You're going to see this the same. Just to be clear, I've had really good employees who never took stock options, but they were really, really good employees. And the reason is just that they are extremely risk averse, or they have a lot of high expenses. And look, I also want to be very clear from a CEO side, nothing is better if you have employees with high expenses, because they're really, really attached to your company and they're really dependent on your company and they really want to do a good job. So there's always a trade-off on this, right? So I'm wearing kind of different hats when I make this video. I, on the one hand, want to give you good tips on the employee side, but on the other hand, I really want to give you tips on the CEO side. So kind of don't put this against the person if the person doesn't take ESOPs. But if the person takes ESOPs, to me, this is always a very strong indication, a very good indication. And obviously from the employee side, I would really kind of reflect why you wouldn't want to take the stocks. Sure, it can be that you really need the cash, but then you should also kind of reflect, maybe you're doing this because you're not so sure about the company stock, right? So just reflect on this. Valuations, how much, and so on. I'm not going to go into details. This is really, really complicated. Generally, there's two kind of schools of thoughts. The first one is you give the company a valuation, then you look at the compensation package. So let's say, for example, $200,000, and you kind of vest this, let's say, over 4 years. And then you look at how much is the company worth, let's say $20 million. So that would be about 1%. So then you say, okay, sorry, that's 0.1%. So then you, 1%, sorry, 200 out of 20 million, 1%. And then you vest this over 4 years. Different vesting schedules. Again, we can do an entire video on this. But this is one school of thought. And the other school of thought is you simply go by percentage, right? So you don't really do this calculation, but you just go and say, I know, VPs get this amount, head offs get this amount, and so on. Two different kind of options in this. Upsides of ESOPs, I mean, that's how generational wealth is built. Downside, there's no guarantee. So they may become worthless. And from an employee standpoint, if you work in a company where you're not as lucky that the company then buys back all your ESOPs if something doesn't work out, you need to expect that they become worthless, right? I mean, that's the honest deal is that. Tax-wise, they're quite tax efficient. So if possible, try to get ESOPs because from a tax side, it's quite a good deal. That brings me to the last one. Any kind of commission, sales commission, any kind of a bonus tied to actual revenue. The upside of that, very straightforward, is that if it's based on performance, right? So it works really well where you have this direct feedback loop in sales, for example. And we've had this. So in our group, when we did sales, we actually had this for our salespeople. We had these bonuses tied to concrete sales, which makes a lot of sense, right? I think that's really straightforward. The downside is there's not really that much downside other than that it's obviously a flexible kind of income. So it's performance-based, but that is also the upside. Tax-wise, it's treated many times similar to how regular income is treated. There's just some areas in the company where you can't really do this, right? I mean, certain creative jobs, engineering, it's very difficult to do these kind of things. Because how do you do it? For every line of code, at the end, good engineers many times write very few lines of code, right? So just kind of keep that a bit in mind. But at the end, you as a CEO, you kind of have to get a good mix of all these three kind of types and get a bit of a sense on how much from each, because at the end, that's going to incentivize the team. It's going to motivate them, but also give them some financial stability. So these are my thoughts. Happy Friday, everyone. If you have questions, let me know down below. Make sure you follow us. Also, check out our app. We're testing internally right now the new Fiat on-ramp, going really well. Hope we can push it out to everyone. So team is really, really working hard. New coins launching, the bundles. It's quite an exciting week. With this, see you tomorrow. Thanks so much, Julian. Bye-bye.